Philosophy of Mind, Lecture 4, The Identity Theory.
In the last lecture, we explored psychoanalysis and behaviorism, both offering themselves as candidates for the science of the mind, the former in a way compatible with Cartesian substance dualism, and the latter most vigorously rejecting that dualism. Whatever the merits of psychoanalysis, it didn't seem to succeed as a science, and whatever the merits of behaviorism, its overall demerits ultimately led it to bite the dust. In this lecture, we now turn to the next alternative to dualism, a theory known simply as the identity theory. Though behaviorism failed in most thinkers' eyes, physicalism itself was not defeated. According to physicalism, recall, the world is fundamentally composed of physical objects with physical properties. So if one couldn't, in the end, identify mental states and properties with physical behaviors and behavioral dispositions, another option was available. One could claim that mental states are just identical to physical states. And of course, the most plausible candidates with which to identify mental states would simply be the states of the brain, for surely the brain is the physical entity most closely related to our mental lives. We thus get the identity theory, stated very simply, mental states are identical to brain states. This theory is directly opposed to dualism, for it straightforwardly denies that the mental is distinct from the physical. And of course, it's also opposed to behaviorism, which identifies mental states not with brain states, but with behavioral dispositions. So according to the identity theory, if I believe that my wife Gabby makes the best gazpacho, my believing that is not for me to be in some irreducible mental state, or to be disposed to behave in any particular way. It's just for my brain to be in a certain state. We may not know precisely which state that is. That's the job of the neuroscientist. But if the arguments are any good, which we'll explore below, we might still have reason to believe that it's true. There's no doubt that the identity theory is very intuitive to many. I find that many non-philosophers quite naturally say things like, the mind is just the brain, or mental activity just is brain activity, and nothing more. And there's no doubt that the identity theory has a lot going for it, even to philosophers, for it seems on the surface to reconcile three very important facts. First, that we truly do have mental states. Second, that our mental states have something to do with our brains. And third, that our brains are purely physical entities. The identity theory nicely accommodates all three of these. It grants we have mental states. These are very closely related to our brain states, i.e. identical to them, and of course our brains are purely physical entities. Further, the identity theory fits nicely with our scientific knowledge of the biological development of human beings. We can observe quite closely through imaging the development of an embryo into a fetus, into a baby, and of course we can observe babies' developments into children and adults. What we observe as scientists is the development of a brain and brain activity, amongst other things. What we don't ever observe is some special point at which a mind gets added to a developing being. But of course, for the identity theorist, that makes perfect sense. If mental states are just certain kinds of brain states, there is no point where the mind gets added on to the brain. Rather, it's just when the brain activity develops to a certain stage that the brain activity subsequently counts as mental activity. The dualist, to the contrary, has to struggle with the question of just when it is exactly the mind gets added to or attached to the developing brain. And finally, the identity theory fits very nicely with something known as Occam's razor. Named after the medieval theologian William of Occam, Occam's razor is a methodological principle stated most succinctly this way: one should never multiply entities beyond necessity. The idea is straightforward. If you're trying to come up with a theory of how some phenomena works, if you're trying to make sense of something, then all else being equal, the simpler theory, the one that invokes fewer basic entities, is to be preferred. This principle is widely employed in empirical science. One's goal as a scientist is to explain as many different phenomena as possible with the simplest, most efficient theory. Well, all else being equal, the identity theory fits Occam's razor better than dualism. The dualist claims that mental activity cannot be reduced to physical or brain activity, and so there are at least two basic sorts of things in the world, mind and matter. But the identity theorist claims that everything in the world can be explained by merely invoking physical matter. So if you want to avoid multiplying entities beyond necessity, the identity theory is certainly worth pursuing. That does, of course, assume the identity theory can explain everything it needs to, and we'll take a look at those arguments shortly. But before we do, we need to get just a bit more precise about what the identity theory is actually asserting. The three basic assertions of the identity theory. First, note that what the identity theory asserts is not merely that mental states and brain states are correlated with each other, but something stronger. They're identical. We can often have correlation between two things without identity. Perhaps every time your alarm clock rings, you wake up, but we wouldn't say that the event of the alarm ringing is identical to the event of your waking up. One is rather the cause of the other. So the key claim of identity theory is that there's more than correlation, there's identity. This means we'll need some theory about when exactly two apparently different things actually count as identical. It turns out, not surprisingly since philosophers are involved, that the idea of identity is probably a little bit more complex than you might have realized. And in fact, the question of identity arises fairly often in philosophical discussions. Here are a few samples. Is Clark Kent identical to Superman? Is the morning star, the bright object often seen in the morning sky, identical to the evening star, the bright object often seen in the evenings? Is light identical to electromagnetic radiation? Is heat identical to molecular motion? Is Michelangelo's statue of David identical to the lump of marble of which it's composed? Are the New York Yankees identical to the set of overpaid players constituting the team at any given time? In a few moments, we'll explore a principle known as Leibniz's law, a principle philosophers use whenever they're confronted with an identity question. And once we see how Leibniz's law works, we'll apply it to the question of whether mental states can be said to be identical to brain states. So that's the first basic assertion of the identity theory. Not that mind and brain are correlated, but that they're identical. Second basic assertion, it's that what the identity theory asserts is only that all mental states are identical to brain states, but not the opposite. It's not claiming that all brain states are identical to mental states. And this, too, makes intuitive sense. There's no reason to think that absolutely every state of the brain gives rise to a mental state. So this is a point about which both dualism and physicalism could happily agree. And third, the third basic claim of the identity theory is actually a fairly technical one. It's that the kind of identity between mental and physical is what's known as a type identity, not merely a token identity. To understand this assertion, we'll take a few minutes to elaborate on the distinction between type identity and token identity. Here's one way to explain the distinction. We notice not merely that there are many different individual things existing in the world, but that these things often may be classified into categories. Here's a nickel, here's a dime, here's a dollar bill. These are all individual instances of the more general category of money. Here's a bird, here's a rhinoceros, there's a fish, individual instances of the general category animal. These general categories all bring together individuals will differ in various ways, but also which have something in common, the general property which places them in the category, the property of being money, property of being an animal in our examples. But then, too, there are categories of things which in fact resemble each other, sometimes very closely. Consider two shiny, brand new, just minted dimes. They may essentially share every distinguishable physical property. Or perhaps better, think about two basic particles from physics, such as two electrons. These seem to be exactly identical to each other, except for one thing. There are two of them. What we might say in these cases is this. There are indeed two electrons, two token individual electrons, but together they constitute only one type of thing, electron. We may have two token dimes, but these are two tokens of the very same single type, namely dime. And more generally still, we may have some token nickels, dimes, and dollar bills, that is, individual nickels, dimes, and dollar bills, but these are all of the same single, more general type, money. So tokens are individual instances of things, while types are the more general categories under which individual things may get classified. Type identity versus token identity. Consider now what it means to assert that there's a type identity in place. It means that what appear to be two different types, in fact, really are the same single type. The great ancient Greek thinker Aristotle believed, for one example, that the defining essence of a human being is that we are rational animals. So for him, the type human being just is the same type as the type rational animal, despite the fact that we use different words or expressions to refer to them. So for him, there aren't these two types of things in the world. There's just one type called by two different names, human being, rational animal. But now type identities have ramifications for identities between the individuals of the type, that is, the tokens. If the type human being is identical to the type rational animal, then every token individual human being must also be a token individual rational animal. If two types are identical, in other words, then all the individual tokens or members of the first type will also be individual tokens or members of the second type. So if Fred is a token human being, he'll also be a token rational animal, given the type identity between human being and rational animal. The identity theory as a type identity theory. We can now go ahead and apply this idea to the mind-brain case before us. The identity theory as a type identity theory now claims this: every type of mental state is identical to some type of brain state. There are, of course, many types of mental states. There are different types of sensations, such as pains, pleasures, tastes, smells, etc. There are different types of intentional states, such as thinkings, believings, desirings, etc. And indeed, there are different subtypes of each of these, such as believing one thing versus believing some other thing. So what the identity theory is claiming is that each specific type of mental state is identical to some specific type of brain state. So suppose Fred is feeling a very specific kind of pain. On the identity theory, his feeling that pain is identical with his brain being in a very specific state. Let's call it the state of neuron 17 firing, or N17 for short. When Fred is feeling some other kind of pain, he's in some other specific brain state, let's say N22. And when Fred is thinking that it would be nice if the Yankees failed to make the playoffs for once, he's in some other specific kind of brain state, say N212, and so on. So we're matching mental state types with brain state types. And of course, since this is a type identity, the reverse will hold as well. If feeling that pain is identical to N17, then every time he feels that pain, he's in N17, and every time he's in N17 specifically, he'll be feeling that pain. Or in other words, every token instance of feeling that pain is a token instance of being in N17, and vice versa. Since the classic proponents of identity theory, who are the philosophers U.T. Place and J.J. Smart, were type identity theorists, that's the version of the theory that we will look at. In particular, we'll explore Smart's work, since he so clearly lays out the central issues, and with a name like that, how could you not pay attention to what he has to say? Smart, in turn, focuses not on intentional states, but specifically on qualia, so that shall be our focus in what follows as well. And finally, since much of Smart's classic essay on the subject is constituted by his responding to various objections to the identity theory, we'll follow his strategy. So let's go ahead and turn to some objections to identity theory. Objection number 1 to the identity theory. Mental words, it is objected, are not synonymous with neural words, brain words. So when I say, for example, that I'm in pain, I'm not saying N17 is firing. I know perfectly well what I mean when I refer to pain, and what I mean when referring to pain is not state N17 of my brain. Indeed, I, like most people, know little or nothing about how the brain works, and even leading neuroscientists don't know which very specific brain states are correlated with very specific mental states. So how could this pain be identical to N17 when in speaking of pain, I'm speaking of something other than my brain? That's objection number 1. Objections 2 to the identity theory. Leibniz's law objections. This is actually a family of objections, a set of objections, all based on this principle called Leibniz's law. So each of them invoke this principle. It's due to the famous and very important 17th century German philosopher G.W. Leibniz, who developed this principle. Here's Leibniz's law. It says this: if x is identical to y, then whatever is true of x is also true of y. Or to put it in the opposite direction, If something is true of X that is not true of Y, then X must not be identical to Y. So Leibniz's law is a general principle about identity that we can use whenever we're confronted with an identity question. Let's illustrate it with one example. Most people would simply grant that Clark Kent is identical to Superman, as we talked about in an earlier lecture. In a case like this, we note, we really just have two names, Clark Kent and Superman, for one and the same individual. And since there really just is one individual in play here, then of course whatever is true of Clark Kent would be true of Superman. They're the same guy. So Leibniz's law nicely captures our intuition that Clark Kent is identical to Superman. And so too, it seems intuitive that if we could find something true of X that isn't true of Y, then we'd have to say that X is not identical to Y. They must be different things if one has a property that the other one lacks. So Leibniz's law provides a kind of test we can use to help us answer identity questions which are perhaps not as intuitive as the Clark Kent-Superman case, such as whether mental states are identical to brain states, for example. So let's now turn to the family of objections here, all of which claim that there are things true of mental states that aren't true of brain states, or vice versa, and so claim that there can't be an identity between mental and brain. We'll look at three such objections together, and then afterwards consider some replies. So let's call this objection 2A. Mental states, it's noted, are knowable by introspection in a way that brain states are not. What does this mean? Well, you might recall from Lecture 1, we addressed this somewhat. How do you know what mental state you're in? You just do. You are directly aware of your qualia, that is, your pains, your pleasures, your sensations, and so, too, you seem directly aware of your intentional states, your thoughts, beliefs, and desires. You don't need any special mechanisms or special instruments to know what qualia you're having or what thoughts you're having. You just do. To the contrary, we have no idea what brain states we're in. We may not even know anything about the brain, and some people, such as little children, may not even know that they have brains. If you do want to find out what brain state you're in, you have to undertake all sorts of complicated procedures. You get your brain measured by EEGs or imaged by MRIs or CAT scans or undergo brain surgery and so on. What you cannot do is simply introspect. We're not directly aware of our brain states. Well then, it seems there's something true of mental states that's not true of brain states. They're knowable by introspection. By Leibniz's law, then, we'd have to say that mental states are not identical to brain states. That's objection 2A. Objection 2B. Let's return to our friend the after image, the example we started the course with. You look at the bright light, you close your eyes, focus on what you see, a fairly bright greenish patch of light which quickly fades. Well, it seems that that patch of light is bright and green. But of course, as we saw, no brain state is bright or green or colored in any way like that after image. So the after image has properties that brain states don't. And by Leibniz's law, they cannot be identified. Similar considerations apply to dream experiences. During a dream, you perceive all sorts of brightly colored things which don't exist physically anywhere, and these things have properties your brain simply doesn't have. Thus, dreamed images equally cannot be identified with any brain states or activities. So, there are things true of after images and dreamed images not true of brain states. They're brightly colored. Thus, neither can be identified with anything in the brain. That's objection 2B. Finally, we turn to objection 2C. Brain states have physical properties, including physical locations, which the corresponding mental states do not. A molecular motion in the brain might be fast or slow or circular or straight, but a given thought or perception is not fast or slow or circular or straight. Or we might have a pain located in our foot, while the corresponding brain state surely isn't located in the foot. Or we might be dreaming of or hallucinating a lemon 2 feet in front of us, but the corresponding brain state isn't in front of us. Or finally, your brain may be at a temperature of 98 degrees, but your belief that it's raining or any of your mental states doesn't have a temperature. All of these considerations from objections 2A through 2C are familiar to us from our initial defense of dualism. These strongly suggest that mental things cannot be identified with physical or neural things. And they do that, we now see, precisely by invoking Leibniz's law, by showing that mental states or things have properties which neural states or things do not, and or vice versa. So that's the family of Leibniz law objections. Let's turn now to objection number 3 to identity theory, something called multiple realizability. So to understand this one, we need to introduce this new concept, multiple realizability. To say that a given thing of a given type is multiply realizable is to say that a thing of that type might actually be realized in, instantiated in, constituted by many different kinds of lower-level types. Consider a few examples. We might say that tables are multiply realizable. Something can be a table, but be made of wood or plastic or metal or any number of other physical things. The same point is true of most ordinary human artifacts, vases, clothing, art, carburetors, etc. You can make a vase out of many different materials, clothing out of many different fabrics. Works of art come in every possible form or medium under the sun, and so on. All of these items are multiply realizable in many different materials. And the same point is true of many rather more abstract things. Consider the concept of money, for example, that we were talking about earlier. This obviously can be realized in many different forms, dollars or yen or rubles or lira. But then each of these can in turn be realized in many different materials, different kinds of metals, different kinds of paper, even as patterns of electricity inside a computer. The higher level concepts in all of these examples are distinguishable from the particular form they might take on the lower level. What we mean by a table is something distinguishable from any particular material a table might be made out of. What we mean by art is something distinguishable from any particular mode or medium of art. And what we mean by the concept money is something distinguishable from any particular form or realization of money. And what that shows in each of these cases is this, that wherever something is multiply realizable, there is no type identity between it and any of the things in which it can be realized. The type table cannot be identified with the type wood, in other words, precisely because tables can be made of other materials. For recall, if type X is identical to type Y, then every token individual of the type X must be a token individual of the type Y and vice versa. So if the type table were identical to the type wood, then every individual token table would have to be made of that wood, which, given the multiple realizability of tables and other materials, is clearly not the case. So wherever there is multiple realizability, there is no type identity between the higher level concept and the lower level concepts. That now allows us to proceed to objection number 3 to the identity theory. It's this. Mental states, it's claimed, are also multiply realizable. In a point made by the eminent Harvard philosopher Hilary Putnam, the very same types of mental states can be manifest in very different sorts of underlying materials. Not only human beings have thoughts and beliefs and sensations, Putnam argues, but so too do all sorts of lower animals. But since animal brains differ dramatically from ours, there's simply no hope of holding that the mental states we might share with such creatures would be realized in the very same types of brain states. Or to put that slightly differently, you can't hold that feeling this pain is identical to brain state N17 if other creatures could be in the very same mental state, feel the very same type of pain, and yet lack brains capable of being in N17. So given that mental states are multiply realized in different sorts of creatures, different sorts of brains, different sorts of matter, we cannot accept a type identity between mental states and our brain states. In fact, we might even make this point more dramatic. It might well be that different human beings, with our different genes and the unique environments in which we all grow up individually, in fact ultimately have very different brains or brain wiring. But then it might well be that no two individual human beings are ever capable of being in exactly the same type of brain state. Yet surely no one doubts that we can share mental states, many mental states. We all experience the same sorts of qualia, sensations. We're all capable of the same kinds of thoughts or beliefs. You and I might have the same belief about something, same desires. Well, if we can share mental states, but do not share brain states, then we cannot identify mental state types with brain state types. So objection 3, again, in short, is this. The multiple realizability of the mental in the physical undermines the type identity between the mental and the physical, and so undermines identity theory. So those are 3 objections to the identity theory. Let's now turn to see how the identity theorist might reply to these objections. Reply to objection 1. The first objection noted that mental words are not synonymous with neural words. The word pain just does not mean what N17 means, as evidenced by the fact that we know perfectly well what we mean when we speak about pain, even when we have literally no knowledge of our brains. This objection uses the nature of our language in order to resist the identity between mental states and brain states. But the mistake in this objection, according to the identity theorist, is that it misunderstands some very important facts about language. In particular, we need to ask ourselves what exactly meaning is. And as you explore that question, you'll quickly find yourself making an important distinction, namely between the meaning of a certain word and the object that the word refers to, what philosophers call its denotation. We'll illustrate with a famous example due to the 19th century German philosopher and logician Gottlob Frege. For many centuries, it was observed that a certain bright object regularly appeared in the early evening sky, which came to be called the evening star. For equally many centuries, it was observed that another bright object regularly appeared in the early morning sky, which came to be called the morning star. At some point, astronomers came to realize both that neither object was in fact a star, and more importantly, that there weren't 2 of them. Rather, it was the same planet, Venus, which could often be seen both at night and in the morning. And with this important astronomical realization, philosophers of language made an equally important one with respect to language. It's this. No one would argue that the phrase, the words, the evening star, has the same meaning as the phrase, the morning star. After all, when these phrases were originally coined, the objects in question were thought to be distinct, and even now, the phrases differ only insofar as one includes the word morning while the other includes the word evening. And since nobody holds that the word morning has the same meaning as the word evening, these 2 phrases also must differ in meaning. And yet, although the phrases differ in meaning, they share a denotation. That is, they pick out or refer to the very same object. And so, the meaning of an expression must be distinguished from its denotation, because in some cases 2 expressions can be different in meaning, as the evening star and the morning star are, even while denoting the very same thing, having the same denotation. Recognizing this fact about language now provides the identity theorist with her reply to the first objection, for she can now simply grant that the word pain is not synonymous with any neural expression such as N17. All she's claiming is this, that the denotation of pain, what thing is actually referred to by the word, is identical to the denotation of N17. As we've seen in the Venus case, 2 expressions can differ in meaning and yet denote the very same thing. And that's precisely what's going on here, says the identity theorist. The word pain and the expression N17 differ in meaning. They don't mean the same thing, but they do denote the very same thing, namely that state of the brain we're calling N17. So, pain can indeed be identical to N17, despite our linguistic intuitions to the contrary. So replies the identity theorist to objection number 1. Reply to objections 2. Remember, this was a whole set or family of objections. Each one of them relied on Leibniz's law to prove that mental states are not identical to brain states by trying to find properties that mental states had but brain states do not. According to objection 2a, it was claimed that mental states are knowable by introspection in a way that brain states are not. But the identity theorist's reply here is to flip that argument on its head. You only get that difference if you already assume that mental states are not identical to brain states. For if in fact they are, then what we're introspecting just are our brain states, even if we don't recognize them as such. And in fact, once we have greater knowledge of the brain, we might even start to say, upon stepping on a nail, for example, ouch, I'm in neural state N17. So that's the response to objection 2a. Maybe it is our brain states we are introspecting after all, even if we don't recognize it. According to objection 2b now, it was mental items such as after images which have properties lacked by brain states, such as colors, suggesting the former can't be identified with the latter. Here, the identity theorist replies by observing that what she is claiming is not that after images themselves are identical to brain states, but rather the experience of having or perceiving after images. And nobody is ever tempted, she claims, to believe that the experience itself has any color. Indeed, you may be perceiving yellow when you're looking at a lemon, but nobody holds that the experience of perceiving is itself yellow, even when it is of yellow. So nothing precludes identifying the experiences of perceiving after images with brain states, the identity theorist replies. Still, this reply isn't likely to fully satisfy the critic. After all, we use these examples to motivate our original dualism at the start of the course, and even if we were willing to agree that, strictly speaking, experiences of colors are not themselves colored, it seems we still have those pesky after images to contend with. Isn't that greenish after image real? If so, then doesn't there exist some real green thing, which obviously isn't a physical thing, much less a brain thing? And isn't that enough to reject identifying the mental with the physical or neural in general? So here, the identity theorist must get quite subtle. What we must do, she urges, is drop the instinct to call these things real. Sometimes, she says, we see things which just aren't real. After images, dreams, hallucinations. Just because we have a perceptual experience of an X doesn't mean there really exists some X which we are perceiving. Indeed, rather than say we sometimes see something which isn't real, what we ought to say more precisely is sometimes we seem to see something when in fact there is no such thing to be seen. And once we recognize that after images are cases where we merely seem to perceive something without actually perceiving any real thing, we'll no longer be tempted to say there really exists some greenish after image which has properties to distinguish it from anything physical. So that's the reply to objection 2b. According to objection 2c now, it was claimed that brain states have physical properties including locations, which mental states do not. But the identity theorist's reply here can be quite brief given the preceding. She offers no objection to saying that our experience of an after image is located in one's brain, even if the after image itself experienced doesn't seem to have a location. Similarly, the activity of dreaming may well have a physical property, such as a temperature, even if the things being dreamed do not. So once we identify the brain states not with what we're experiencing, but with the very activity of experiencing itself, then we can grant the mental state of experiencing all the physical properties we like. Putting these together, then, the identity theorist claims that Leibniz's law does not deny the identity between mental states and brain states, that ultimately every property had by mental states is one also had by brain states, and vice versa. This brings us to objection number 3, the third and final objection to the identity theory. This was the claim that mental states are multiply realizable. The very same types of mental states can be found in brains of very different types, which prevents identifying mental state types with any single brain state type. And here we offer a rather surprising response, namely, there isn't one. This objection, in fact, more or less resulted in the demise of the identity theory. It just no longer seemed possible to identify a mental state type with any brain state type. Indeed, the goal of philosophers of mind subsequently became something a little different. They now sought to discover precisely what it might be that, say, the mental state of believing that P, where P is some proposition, might have in common when it's realized or instantiated in brains of very different types. In other words, suppose both you and your dog and even a Martian with a brain made not of carbon but of silicon believe that some delicious meat is on the table. What your token individual beliefs have in common cannot be that all three of you are in the same type of brain state, because that just isn't possible. Your brain is very different from a dog's brain and is very different from a Martian silicon brain. But then, if we grant that you all have the very same belief, what is it that you each have in common such that you count as sharing that same belief, that some meat is on the table? The next theory that we'll look at, our next alternative to dualism, which is known as functionalism, is going to attempt to answer that question. In this lecture, I examined the identity theory, that is, the theory that mental states are identical to brain states. After clarifying that we meant a type identity, we then explored a series of objections to the theory. One of these objections was based on the meanings of our words, a second family of objections was based on Leibniz's law, and the third objection pointed to the phenomenon of multiple realizability. We saw that the identity theorist had substantial responses to the first two objections, but that the third was seen as pretty much defeating the identity theorist. As we'll next see, our next theory, functionalism, grows out of this last problem for the identity theory, so we'll turn to that in our next lecture.
This ends Lecture 4. Remember to visit this course's webpage at www.modernscholar.com, where you'll find additional information about the lectures you just heard.